You're listening to That Jesus Podcast.
Within an Anabaptist framework, the more conservative you get, this isn't totally true, but like the more you adhere to like your Anabaptist fundamentals, I guess I would say, so maybe not conservative or liberal, but the more you adhere to your tradition, the more skeptical you are of like political involvement, the military, using guns and whatever. And so taking that framework and then being like, oh, you're a liberal. It's like, no, my mom and sisters wear head coverings and dresses and I don't wear shorts and, whatever conservative framework. If you looked at my family, you'd think, oh, they're fundamentalists. But if you listen to how we deal with politics and the government and our approach to nonviolence, you would call us a liberal. And having that perspective is helpful because you realize it's like, oh, this kind of tight spectrum where we told to hate each other on one end or the other is actually just kind of a fabricated reality. And when you realize that it's not that you take yourself outside of the American spectrum into other cultural contexts as either as a minority or a minority religious group or just like someone from a totally different country, and you look over at the spectrum and you're like, that's kind of ridiculous. I don't know if I'm making sense at all.
I think there's an element of truth there, but I think it's also a little dishonest to say we're completely removed from that affecting us. So if you look within Anabaptism, you see there's a whole conservative liberal spectrum of Anabaptists. And as you get to the more liberal end of that spectrum, people's view of nonviolence is more closely aligned with pacifism. If you get more to the right of that spectrum, it's non-resistance, which are two pretty different things. Non-resistance, I think, can actually coexist more with the political right than pacifism. Although the political right and the political left are pretty into killing people. There's not a whole lot of difference there these days. And then even within like conservative Anabaptism, there are people who dress the same, look the same, probably even go to the same church, who are on very different places in the political spectrum, have very different opinions about Trump and immigration and very different views about fiscal politics and things like that.
Yeah. I think you're kind of making my point, though.
How so? I'm not trying to. I'm trying to refute it.
Well, I think my point is somewhat that the polls are largely arbitrary. And the stereotypes, like if you went and talked to like any random person, particularly any random like liberal or leftist person here in Philly, and showed them a picture of our families growing up, they would say they are fundamentalist Christians. Maybe they would identify them as Mennonites. And so if they were able to identify them as Mennonites, then they might kind of get close to it. But they would not be able to articulate our politics. But you get into like kind of white American, like people who dress conservatively are almost always going to be right wing politically. They're never going to add, like, you're not going to run into like these sort of fundamentalist conservative, our women dress very conservatively, we live out in the country or whatever. You're never going to run into those types of Christians and say, oh, you are pacifists.
But isn't your family? Well, I guess pacifism is one part here. But like I said, I think
I'm sorry, I'm using pacifist as kind of a catch-all term. They're against killing their enemies.
Right. Still think though. Well, first of all, I think your family is probably the exception to the rule within conservative Anabaptism. Like I think most conservative Anabaptists would be pretty right-wing politically, would be affected very heavily by the fundamentalist movement in evangelicalism.
You think most conservative Anabaptists would be pro-war?
I think most conservative Anabaptists
actually, yes, they might be pro-war. They would just say, I can't do it. But they're very happy that the U.S. is taking out their enemies. They celebrate, the veterans on Veterans Day. They're like, thank you so much for serving our country, blah, blah, blah. I think it probably is affected by the fundamentalist movement, which says like our faith is personal, it's not public, like Billy Graham and all that. I think Anabaptists have kind of sort of soaked that in, and now they can say, I'm happy that the government is going to war and supporting Israel and whatever, but my personal faith would be sullied if I did that, you know?
So I think that's a really interesting...
I think that's quite compatible with right-wing politics or with militant politics across the spectrum.
So I think it's really interesting, Titus, and I wonder if this is actually historically accurate. That's above our pay grade, perhaps. But when Anabaptism lost its sense of community expressions of fidelity to Christ, and it became my personal relationship with Jesus, then the community standing against violence, against war, no longer existed. It was just me. I'm sorry, I can't serve in the military. And that really maybe took the power out of the movement.
When I was at Calvary Bible School, my teacher, non-resistance teacher, very, very strongly brought in the scripture, whoever sheds blood by whatever. What's the verse in Genesis? If you shed blood, your blood will be shed.
Yeah.
He brought that scripture in and just drilled that into our thick skulls, that this is a biblical principle and this is what the government is for. And we are not pacifists. These people out protesting wars is completely not us. That is so wrong. Like it was hammered through, you know?
Yeah. I guess, yeah. I mean, full disclosure, like although like I identified conservative Anabaptist most of my life, like I haven't really effectively been in conservative Anabaptist circles since I was 12. And so I defer to your guys' judgment on like what conservative Anabaptists say. I think I'm still a little bit like surprised if that's like the kind of standard for even, I mean, yeah, I guess it resonates.
I spent most of 2025, or the majority of 2025 anyhow, about 8 months in a conservative Mennonite church, like quite conservative. And I think there were a range of perspectives, but it was actually interesting. The folks that were like 60, 70 years old tended to be the ones that were kind of dog whistling their approval of President Trump and his actions in the Middle East and things like that. And I don't think I think there's a great big loophole in our theology when we look at Romans 12 or Romans 13.
They should read Romans 12.
Where it talks about, not bearing the sword in vain. And it's like, well, yeah, they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, and we do what we're supposed to be doing, and everybody's happy. And I'm so thankful that the government is doing what they're supposed to be doing. It's interesting to me that Wayne, in the conversation about nonviolence, for him, he grew up in, Florida, but he just gradually read his Bible and said, this just isn't compatible with some of the pledging of allegiance and the politics and the kill your enemies mantra I'm hearing. And he just gradually walked away from it because it didn't really make sense to him. And I don't know if
man becomes nonviolent.
Yes, that is the headline. And I don't know if a lot of us have that, a lot of our Mennonite brothers and sisters have that experience so much, where it's just like, oh, this doesn't really make sense when it comes to reading Jesus and then walking away from violence.
Yeah.
So I guess this is the conversation to start our second podcast with Wayne.
Nice. So we can use that first intro.
We shall see. You're going to edit it, Titus? Yes.
Maybe. Send me all the files. I'll see if I can split.
Well, thanks, guys.
For both.
It's always good to chat with you. See you around.
Bye.
I am excited to be back with Wayne, former Florida man, now devout lutefisk eater, right? In northern Minnesota.
Maybe not that far.
No lutefisk, no lefse?
No, it's just, I mean, I tried poutine. The jury's still out on that one. I'm not sure if I'm even pronouncing that correctly, But
Poutine. Yep, that's right.
okay.
Kind of like the French version of Vladimir Poutine. So last time we talked about your just some of the background of the Restorationist movement. We kind of went down a rabbit trail of church polity in your background, and I found it interesting anyhow. Maybe our audience was asleep, but what we really want to hear about is how you went from wanting to kill your enemies to becoming a limp-wristed pacifist.
Well, limp-wristed pacifist. Well,
just go on to start us off right.
I mean, I don't know if my journey is that radical. I mean, I don't think I was ever in the wanting to kill my enemies camp. I mean, I grew up.
Did you grow up in the Church of Christ with more of a Christian nationalist bent? Like my church background would have been very much Christian activism, taking America back for Jesus, pro-military,
okay,
all that.
Well, let's see how much I can recount. So, like, the church I grew up in, and, you get different flavors of churches of Christ, as I mentioned last time. The preacher was very, like, keep politics out of the pulpit. You don't,
okay.
You would never know current events were going on based on his sermons. And it's he was just, like, very much stick to the Bible, keep the politics out of the pulpit. A philosophy that I tend to have adopted for myself in practice, actually. I think it's kind of a healthy thing to do in general, is just to remind ourselves that like the kingdom of God is so much bigger than the events that are driving us insane and giving us anxiety. Not that there's no place to contextualize them, but that we tend to, well, if all of our preaching and our theology is reactionary, then it doesn't work out so great. And so I grew up in a family that didn't really stress those kinds of things. I'd say that probably the big exception to all of that is that one formative event for my generation is 9/11, right? Sure. Terrorists knocked down the towers in the Twin Towers in New York. And I was maybe, do the math, 13 at the time. And okay. So, and that was kind of a major watershed moment for a lot of people. And there's sort of a nationalist fervor that would pop up in our household and in our church community, although not so much in the preaching. Again, I think our preacher kind of resisted that sort of thing. And it wasn't until I got to college and started thinking about these things a little bit again, and started thinking, wait, why don't we question the politics? Why don't we question, everybody I went to church with, everybody I was in school with, it's skewed Republican, it's skewed right-wing politics. Sure. And, it was kind of one of those questions of, well, why don't we question this a little bit more? Why do we think that this is a qualifier? And so I would start saying stuff like, well, Jesus had a zealot and a tax collector for disciples, which means that maybe he didn't think some of these types of political partisan divides were so important. I remember pretty distinctly in 2008 when we had chapel service in college, and they'd always say the Pledge of Allegiance at the end of it. And I remember there was kind of a watershed moment for me when I stopped doing that and stopped participating in that. And I wasn't the only one who felt that way, but one watershed moment for me in that was sort of the realization that there were Christians in the first century who were persecuted because they wouldn't do obeisance to the emperor. And I started to feel increasingly uncomfortable with the way that mapped onto that matrix in that practice. And so that was one kind of a shift moment for me. And I could probably point to different instances in my life where I'm saying, wait a second, that doesn't fit. Wait a second, that doesn't fit. So I start to, and I'm surrounded by people who have very sophisticated defenses for times when violence is justified or when killing in self-defense is justified. Somebody who I count actually as a very dear mentor figure to me was one of the probably makes a pretty convincing argument for why what God will hold governments accountable. And there's sort of this idea of the state, and if you think that God will hold governments accountable, and you think it's okay to participate in it, then what's wrong with being involved in things like law enforcement and military, etc.?
Mhm.
And so he kind of makes the case on those grounds. Now, I'm thinking about it, and the more I start to think about it, though, the more I start to feel like my justifications for that were maybe not very good. And so I tell
Your justifications for...
Well, my justifications for just sort of taking a... I don't know. I see, the thing is, I've always kind of pushed back against, Christians maybe shouldn't consider the military as a wise career option. I've always kind of looked at it from the perspective of, this is not a wise thing to do. This is not a good position to put yourself in. And so I tell people, and I have told people this for a long time, that I am a soft pacifist. And what I mean is, I don't think the biblical case for pacifism and nonviolence, I don't think it's 100% airtight. And I can poke holes in it if I really want to, and I can find exceptions to it if I really want to, and I can if I make aggressive efforts to do so. But the case for violence is so much worse, let's be honest. And the burden of proof, I feel like, doesn't fall on me. It falls on those who want to commit violent acts to justify them. And I had a friend who told me when I said this that soft pacifist sounds even wimpier than a real pacifist. So,
at least own your cowardice.
Yeah, I know, right? At least own it, right? And there's all kinds of like weird qualifiers people would throw at. Like, do we think Jesus overturning tables in the temple counts as violence? Well, I mean, he's not doing what Judas Maccabeus did when he cleansed the temple and killed everyone. He's not doing what Phineas did in his zeal for the holiness of God. So, I mean, Jesus is positively tame by comparison. And
I don't like that word choice.
Positively tame. I know, perhaps that's the wrong word choice. You're right.
I understand what you're saying, though. So you're in college and you're starting to question the sort of passive acceptance of the war in Iraq, let's say.
Yeah. We'll go
and then
with that.
And then you're like, well, I'm not going to say the Pledge of Allegiance at the end of chapel. Were there influences other than Jesus in the Bible that like books you read that were like, oh,
that's a hard thing. Like everybody always says, what were the books that radicalized you? And I mean, the Gospels radicalized me. I can't like point to a book and say, oh yeah, this was the thing I read that just sort of 180'd me on this. There's very few books I could say that about. That were that paradigm shifting for me. There are a couple, but not on this particular issue. I feel like it was just sort of being worn down more and more and more. I think at one point I said, I need to sit down and actually flesh all this out. Because I don't think about things very topically. I'm more of an exegete than a theologian. I'm one of those people who maybe has a distrust of systematic theologians. Which I realize, again, is rife with inconsistencies and can be picked apart. But like whenever I do a research project, it's never, I'm going to study nonviolence, or I'm going to research, the nature of atonement, or I'm going to research this or that. It's usually this month I'm studying Romans, or this month I'm studying Zechariah.
Yep.
And it's very exegetically book-based. And so it was years and years of studying the Gospels, teaching the Gospels, realizing that, wait, Jesus said those who take up the sword would perish by the sword. What is the answer to that? Wait, Jesus said that we're supposed to turn the other cheek and not constantly try to get revenge on everybody. And wait a second, Jesus said my kingdom is not of this world and my servants would fight. And wait a second, the nations of this world are destined to pass away. Why are we fighting for them? And it was just sort of the cumulative effect of that over time that makes me go, oh, this is actually where I'm standing, and this is where I've been standing for a while. My story doesn't have a lot of radical moments of, Paul on the road to Damascus. It's usually just, wait a second, I've been here for who knows how long and haven't really put words to it yet.
And I asked this question because, and maybe this isn't fair, and I'd love to hear your pushback or others that are listening, but it does seem like, in my experience, most Western Christians or Westernized Christians, they're looking at the default position, the obvious position, the total normal position as being just war theory. as being, well, yeah, of course, American military might is ultimately a blessing on the world in the eyes of God, and it's right to defend your country. And how could you possibly question the exaltation of veterans,
No.
or soldiers serving in military duty, or like supporting the president as he looks for weapons of mass destruction?
Yeah.
And so then people, it was interesting that you said the burden of proof lies in them those who want to take violence. And
Sure.
I think they would push back and be like, no, the burden of proof lies in you who want to sit back and do nothing while, women are raped and children are murdered.
So, I mean, the solution to children being murdered is to murder more children. I guess the thing about, so, I mean, we live in there's a bunch of different directions we could go with that, I guess. I mean, just war theory is one of those things where I'm always looked at that with a degree of skepticism and said, wait, like, what even is just war? And so people will list some criteria, and I'll say, okay, well, let's pretend for the sake of argument that I accept that premise and I accept those criteria. I struggle to name a war in living memory that checked every box on the list. And so it's kind of, to me, spells the whole argument as disingenuous, or that, we're kind of grasping at straws a little bit. We make preemptive strikes, or we do those types of things. And when we start thinking about violence itself, I mean, there's no question that violence shows up in the Bible story, right? And it's all over the Old Testament. The world becomes corrupt because Cain and company commit murder, and it goes unaddressed. And then there's the flood, and Noah gets off the ark, and God says, whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood must be shed. And so we think, aha, well, there's the solution to that. Except it's not a solution, and I think God knows it's not a solution. It's a law. It's a talionic eye for eye principle, and it gets expanded and dissected and discussed in the law of Moses. And it becomes a way for society to try to check against violence, because, it's better to hold violent people accountable for their actions than to just let them go unchecked. But it's also law, and law, by definition, makes nothing perfect. That's why we needed the gospel. And so a lot of laws later, violence is still a problem, and that's when Jesus comes in. And Jesus comes in this world telling people that, actually, no, you don't need to do the eye for eye thing. You can turn the other cheek instead. You don't have to swing the sword in the garden. And then the rest of the New Testament keeps making the declaration: the weapons of our warfare are not fleshly. The struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the spiritual forces of wickedness. The way that the Christians in Revelation conquer is not by the point of their own sword, but by shedding the blood of their enemies. It's through the blood of the Lamb, and through the fact that they do not love their own lives even when faced with death. Now, that's not to say that, like, if I know someone is being harmed and I can act to prevent that harm, do I have a responsibility, to try to intervene, to help them escape, to help them flee, to help them do those things? I mean, yeah, you get situations like that, sure. But I think that when we talk about the trajectory of the Bible, we talk about the kingdom trajectory of beating swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. Spoons would be a good thing to beat them into too. It's a description of the ultimate goal of God's kingdom, and at the same time, a reality in which we Christians are meant to begin participating right now. And there's always the counter argument. There's always some invented scenario. One thing that I've always been fascinated by is how many men especially I know, who entertain the fantasy that someone is going to break into their house and they're going to have to make a decision about using lethal force to kill them.
Yep.
And I cannot name a single person who I know personally that this has happened to. At least not that I know of. I don't know. I'm sure somebody in the comments or whatever will now come out of the woodwork to set me straight on that. But I don't know of anyone personally who has confided in me that that's happened to them. And it's never happened to me. And it's never, like, the thought of it happening, there's never been a situation that was even close to it. And so I kind of wonder whence comes that fantasy. And maybe it's just the desire for protection or something like that.
Well, I think, first of all, I do want to acknowledge that there are places around this world where it is a very real concern.
Sure.
And people ask themselves how to deal with this. But frankly, most Christians in persecuted countries are not seeing arming themselves as a solution. You can look, and I'm getting way out over my skis, but you can look in the conflict in Sudan, where you have, or in Rwanda, where you had conflict among Christians and among religious groups, and it didn't help to use violence. But I do want to acknowledge there's a sense, to use a trigger word, but there's a sense of privilege where we're like, we don't deal. That in a couple weeks we'll be, well, by the time our audience is listening to this, we'll probably be in Detroit. And last time I was in Detroit, while I'm preaching at the church I was visiting, down the road, half an hour away from us, where people were attending that people in my church knew, there was a church shooting. And so there is a reality there when you're not living in Minnesota nice or Wisconsin drunk, I guess. But
well, I mean, the Taco John's up the road from me was, robbed just last week. But I don't know. I guess it's.
But statistically, it's unambiguously clear that you are at far greater risk for gun injury, you and people you love, if you have a gun in your house than if you don't.
Yeah, that's true.
So there's a practical refutation of that. And then in my mind, one of the biggest things is, okay, so maybe there's an extreme situation there. Maybe there's this like off chance at the far end of the bell curve that something could happen. Let's not build our lives around that extreme scenario. Let's build our lives around the 99.9% of the times where loving your enemies is actually what works. And I use that argument feeling that Jesus has an answer even for the extreme situations. Mm-hmm. But if we could at least agree on the vast majority of the situations, we're most of the way there.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good way to think about it. For me, I guess it's there's some conversation to be had about what we say moral injury, right? Where situations where we find ourselves in a situation where it's impossible not to do something that is going to injure our conscience, right? Not to commit some kind of, I don't know, not to commit some kind of sin, we might say. It's like the story of Rahab lying to protect the spies. Well, what's the alternative? That she turns them in. That wouldn't have been, that's not better. And so.
And do we build our ethics around that extreme scenario?
No, we don't I don't know anyone who takes the Rahab story and says, oh, well, she lied in this context, in this extreme situation. So that means that there's really nothing wrong with lying. I don't know anyone who reads that story that way. If I can
But sometimes we tend to, it seems like we kind of think that way, right? When it comes to this question of nonviolence, though.
Yes. And I think that's just it. If we can envision an extreme situation where acting to save someone's life in a way that is violent is somehow, there's a felt justification for it. And I'm not saying that's impossible. I think that's a highly possible situation. Do we build our entire thinking about this around that? It's when people talk about, well, shouldn't we intervene in difficult situations to help people that are being oppressed or suffering or miserable? And that sometimes we could justify war on those grounds. Assuming that just war even existed, does that therefore mean that we are engaging in it? And those two things don't necessarily become the case. And
it goes a step further. Is just war theory legitimate? Secondly, does just war theory exist outside the theoretical? And finally, even if it does exist outside the theoretical, does that mean that it's our responsibility? Romans 13 tends to, as Christians, Romans 13 really seems to have an us versus them. The government, the king, those who bear the sword, and then us. And they're two separate groups he's speaking to. Sorry, I'm getting excited.
Well, no, I mean, Romans 13 needs to be read to the end. The government may bear the sword, but we are called to take up the armor of light. And there's a much different thing that's going on with the armor we take up against the darkness than the sword that the government bears. I mean, what is the government in the context of Romans 13? Well, the last governmental figure we met was in Romans 9. It was Pharaoh, And it says, well, yeah, God raised him up, gave him power.
That's
For
a
what
great point.
purpose? For his destruction. And it's the same
Yep.
thing. And so, I mean, when we read Romans 13 and we say, oh, well, no authority exists except that which is from God, remember that circle you're drawing includes the Pharaoh of the Exodus, who God gave authority solely for the purpose of destroying him. And when we understand that context, maybe it changes the way I think about the civil government relationship. Some people, I think, that the pay taxes to Caesar story is another one where people will say that, oh, well, Jesus said pay Caesar your taxes. And it's kind of like if the question is meant to trap Jesus no matter which way he answers. If he answers in a way that says pay your taxes and nothing more, then didn't he just fall into their trap? But when you read what he says, it's give Caesar's what is Caesar's, give God what is God's. In other words, there are very real things that don't belong to God's. What belongs to Caesar is just that, and it'll perish with him.
Yeah.
We're all worked up about where our money's going to go. We should be more worked up about where we're going to go.
So, well, that's such an interesting point about the connection there with money and empire. I think, frankly, a lot of folks from the Anabaptist tradition that I've kind of adopted myself into, we tend to focus on don't bear the sword, don't fight people, don't kill. And I think if Jesus was here, he'd be like, well, I kind of included the pursuit of money in that whole thing of the other kingdom. And I'm not saying we can't be good money managers or we can't pursue business, but it should give us pause when Jesus is like, you can't serve both God and mammon. As if mammon belongs to the other kingdom.
I think we tend to extol. There's a kind of a bothersome trend to me, I guess, in the way that we tend to put the rich on a pedestal. We tend to extol them. We know their names, and this is what's interesting to me in the Gospels, especially the Gospel of Luke, is we know the names of hardly any of the wealthy people at all. People make a big deal out of the fact that Lazarus is named in the story of the rich man and Lazarus. Lazarus is named, and the rich man isn't. And that's the point, because in our world, the opposite is true. We know who the rich guy is because, he's a multi-billionaire who, advises the leaders or something like that. Yeah. But we don't know the name of the homeless man who lives on our street. And Jesus does. And it kind of raises, it's kind of almost a guilt-inducing thing. Like, do I know the names of the poor neighbors that I have around me?
So, let's come back to your kind of personal story.
Yes.
You gradually became convinced and sort of solidified your view of what Jesus calls us to and away from. But you're also a full-time minister for the past 15 years. How has that worked out for you? What does that look like in the pulpit? What does that look like as you counsel people?
Well, I mean, it's not that outlandish of a position in our tradition, actually. I mean, you think about, the Restoration Movement had a guy in it whose name is almost synonymous with non-participation and non-involvement in these types of things. And there's this guy, if you can research him, David Lipscomb, who was in the 1800s. He was a major publication writer, and he argued Christians shouldn't be involved in government.
He started a university or something, right?
Yeah, David Lipscomb has a university named after him. But he was very big on the, he didn't even think people should vote. He didn't even think Christians should vote, and would even kind of consider that an act of violence almost. I don't know anyone that goes that far. And so, but I don't know anyone who goes that far. But
in the Church of Christ tradition.
In Churches of Christ. I don't know anyone who goes that far. But that's kind of like, people start thinking I'm becoming a radical. It's like, well, I haven't gone that far. Although I don't know. I mean, is write-ins and third-party candidates count as voting anymore? I don't even know if that makes sense. But what I would, the trajectory of all of that, I guess it just hasn't been that extreme of a thing, because I'll point it out in the Gospels and I say, look, the Gospels say this. What do you all make of it? And I've, as in any church tradition setting, you'll find some people that agree and some people that disagree. and some people that offer pushback. And, we'll have conversation and we'll try to keep it respectful. I try to be respectful and to remember that I didn't become convinced overnight, and the people around me aren't going to be either if they're thoughtful, and you kind of don't want them to be.
I think that's actually a really important point to underline, because for a lot of folks who grow up in a peace tradition, like probably 80-90% of our audience, it's sort of taken for granted, and you either are or you're not. My experience was much more gradual, like yours, and there were a few pivotal points I could point to. I read this book, I talked to this people, I had this experience, but there's nothing wrong. Like, sometimes we're purists and we're not cool. It's like, Wayne Welsh votes? I thought he was nonviolent. Like, there will be some people thinking that and struggling with the fact that you may or may not vote. Because most of the folks in the Anabaptist tradition would reject, and even their church rules would forbid the allowing to vote.
So they can't even vote for like a write-in candidate as a joke or something like that, like I did.
Some churches wouldn't. A lot of the more conservative churches would definitely say no.
Oh, I can understand and appreciate that perspective.
But the point here is that, like, folks like you or those who are increasingly uncomfortable with the military-industrial complex or this sort of cowboy approach to Jesus, like, they're headed in the right direction. And we don't want to have some sort of purity test that separates us.
Right. I think, when we talk about, being convinced of something gradually and taking time, you don't want people to be convinced instantly and easily. Because if they can be convinced to your position easily, they can be dissuaded from it just as quickly. And so it sort of cheapens that particular intellectual victory. We like it, of course, when they're switching to something that we think is, well, that's, that they're on my side now. Great. But if we're the sort who are tossed to and fro by every wind and wave of doctrine, then what is that victory really? Well, there's no substance to it. It's seed thrown into rocky soil that is just going to spring up and wilt.
So as you look at the church today, like last time we talked, I asked you about the Church of Christ, and I'm just going to ask you about all of Christianity. As you look at the church today, there's a lot of folks are saying, Christian nationalism really is on the rise. Folks like Douglas Wilson up in Moscow, and then just like the rise of the Christian right in the 90s with James Dobson and Chuck Colson and Pat Robertson and Pat Buchanan, on and on. And now finding its apex or nadir in Donald Trump. Some people would look and say this is really a threat to Christianity, and others would say it's way overblown, and then there are some who would celebrate it and say this is the point of being the church. What does Wayne say?
Well, let's see. So I know most of the names you're saying, although, like I said, we tend to track, I think I said in the other episode that we tend to track maybe 10, 20 years behind whatever trends are going on in evangelicalism. Christian nationalism is an oxymoron to me, frankly, because it doesn't, the whole notion of showing favoritism to one nation over another when we're espousing a kingdom that is supposed to be the end of all nations and, to break down all the kingdoms of this world, is to me so oxymoronic. I can't even begin to fathom it and get my brain around it. The implementation of, I know that there's a more particular definition of Christian nationalism that says it's about implementing Christianity as the law of the land. That doesn't make me feel much better, because my next question is which Christianity? Because there's a lot of Christianities, and not all of them have been good, and most of them have the ones that are more inclined to ally with the state and to see the state as their friend are generally the versions of Christianity that seem to be the most far departed from, that kind of primitivist vision of what Jesus was about and what the apostles were about. I can't fathom, Jesus telling his disciples that they need to get elected to the Roman Senate and, impose all of what values were they going to impose? We're no longer going to have judicial punishments and things like that. I just don't see that. And then, of course, you mentioned Trump. Sorry,
I have to do it every episode. It's in my contract.
I've been having that argument with people I know for close to a decade now, and it's a little exhausting, frankly, because most people have made up their minds one way or another. I feel like all of the evidence was very patently on display in 2016. And if it didn't convince you then, I'm not sure what would convince people now. He's very much the opposite of everything I claim to believe in and care about. I'm less bothered by his presence and more bothered by how people can be so enamored with him and how they can insist so stubbornly that the emperor is wearing clothes when he's clearly not. That's my.
So how do you?
On that.
Yeah, well, so then you've been wrestling with this for 10 years and you're tired of it, but like realistically, I mean, Minnesota isn't nearly as purple as Wisconsin is, but
No.
you get all stripes there. What how do you deal with that as a follower of Jesus, to like love people who actually think the emperor's clothes are pretty awesome? How do you do that with grace?
That's the other thing you try to spend 10 years figuring out. And I still love people. I love people even when they're misguided. In some ways it's helped me, I guess, appreciate, I have to love people. I have to love people from both sides of the political aisle, regardless of how delusional or misguided I think them to be. How many deluded things have I done and said in my life, and Jesus still loves me? So there is that. That doesn't mean I'm not going to, take the opportunity to challenge a little bit on their perspectives. I feel more obligated to do it with people I'm close to. I don't see a lot of profit in having this argument like in a public forum on the internet, for instance, where people are just going to keyboard war about it. But in private conversation.
Wait, you're saying that the internet doesn't change people's minds?
It can, depending on the context, but usually not fly-by-night strangers. It's funny because I've had conversations with people online, and then afterwards, and in one case, a guy like a year later messages me and goes, "Hey, I finally took the time to think about what you said. You were right. I changed my mind." And I loved that he said that to me, and I kind of try to do that with people whenever they change my mind on something, because
I like that.
It's helpful to see that we see so much of the bad and the ugly in that. And I'm not even saying that. I look at the state of affairs in the way that people are looking at things politically and the candidates they've chosen to support. People vote for 1,000 different reasons. Yep. I don't make who people votes for a tested fellowship, because I don't think that that's a wise thing to do or a good precedent to set. You can be my brother in Christ no matter who you voted for. But I think the manner in which we approached it and the way that we approached it and the motives that we had need to be interrogated more closely and more carefully. And it has definitely served to drive me into a position of being borderline not wanting to vote at all, because I don't see the fruit of it, because I don't see the benefit. Because it's just like, at the end of the day, it's the dead trying to bury their dead, and maybe I don't want to pick up the shovel.
Well said. Last question, and this is a hard turn, but I want to know, because a key thing we focus on at That Jesus Podcast is, how are we loving Jesus and following Jesus and getting to know Jesus better? So what does your quiet time look like? What are some spiritual disciplines that you engage in that are working for you right now?
I need to be a better disciplined person is what I'm thinking about.
That's what they all say, Wayne.
That's what they all say. That's a stereotypical answer, right?
I should do better in my prayer life.
Well, it's one of those things where it's like, I used to take, I go through phases, right? I have a phase in my life where it's like, okay, I'm going to take this quiet time to go pray in this context. And or I'll take this, this time to sit and read the scripture and to kind of meditate on it some. But then, of course, the busyness of life catches up to you.
Yeah.
We're a society that impossibly schedules themselves to death. And I have to be a dad, and I have to be a minister, and I have to do this, and I have to do that, and meet all these responsibilities. So it kind of looks like a sine wave. The ups and downs of it. I believe in, that that engaging in prayer and reading scripture are two very valuable things to do. I feel like I try to take time just to read it, just to let it sort of breathe for itself. One of the problems that I think, one of the traps that someone like me can sometimes get caught into, is reading the Bible purely as an intellectual pursuit, and just, I gotta squeeze a lesson out of this, or I gotta engage in some kind of industrious research project in which I'm dissecting the text and doing all that. And the thing about dissection is that you typically have to kill a thing to dissect it. And that's not always helpful. And so we have to, I do have to, I don't know how good I am at this, but I try to remind myself that the word is living and active, and that it's supposed to be something that transforms me and changes me in meditating on it. I don't know how helpful that answer was, but
Yeah, no, it's a good tension that I definitely resonate with. To not dissect it all the time. There's a place for that, and to wrestle through, like, what did Jesus actually mean when he said, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's"?
Right.
But also just step back and, like you said, soak in it, meditate on it. Yeah. Well, thank you for your time, Wayne, and thank you for being up in northern Minnesota, and for your relationship with my family. And it's been a blessing to know you, and I hope that this has been a blessing to everybody who made it through both conversations.
All right. Well, thanks for having me on, and I appreciate it. And Lord bless you and your efforts.
Thanks. Take care.